Hello and welcome to the Baaz Podcast. I am your host, Shabd Singh. This week we talked to Mankamal Singh on the case of the West Midlands 3. Before we get into that, where we'll talk about topics of trade relations between UK and India and how that trade relationship has often intersected with and come at the cost of human rights abuses by India, and UK is looking the other way. We are here every other Tuesday. We speak to thinkers and journalists and contributors to Baaz about their work in Baaz or about issues pressing of the day in regards to the Sikh and Punjabi diaspora, as well as issues back in India. So without further ado, please do have a listen, and hope you enjoy this talk with Mankamal Singh. Mankamal Singh, welcome to the Baaz Podcast.
Thank you, Shabd.
It's a pleasure to have you. Before we get going and talking about this recent case of the West Midlands 3 and some of the context that leads into it, I wonder if you can introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners and tell them a bit about yourself, about your work that you do as it pertains to this case, and also a bit about how you came to cover these issues in general.
Sure. I mean, my involvement in the case is literally as a how can I put it, as a bystander, as a UK-based Sikh who has been interested and close to Sikh issues over the last 15 or so years. That's my interest in this case. I wasn't involved on the legal side or heavily involved in any other way, but it was actually as a spectator as such. But I felt the need to put some opinions forward and share what I felt was not being picked up by the mainstream, and that was the big concern as an observation. Now, I mean, just to give a backdrop of the Sikh active Sikh community in the UK, it is quite close knit, and I don't know how it works in the US and Canada, for instance, but the UK being smaller geographically, activism, campaigns, they tend to have not the same number of people, but you get familiar with the people involved. And since I came into Sikhi around about mid 2000s and becoming more involved with the activism scene, I started meeting more and more people, and you develop a bond, and you develop a very deep bond actually when you're involved in campaigns together. So two of the Midlands 3, I have known them over the years. I've met him at Kirtan Samagams, I've met him at camps, and so I know, who they are. And having seen this story evolve, obviously, it felt more personal because there is a more personal connection there as well. So that's how sort of the interest that I had in the case. But the main driving point, if you want to call it, was literally the fact that this had all the ingredients that should have been picked up by the mainstream, I felt, and the fact that the mainstream's lack of interest is systemic and is something that we perhaps may not be able to address, but we need to be aware of that lack of interest in Sikh stories and Sikh activism.
Yeah, certainly. And to that extent, you did write a very compelling article, I thought, titled "The Extraordinary Case of the West Midlands 3" for Baaz. And in that, you do touch on, in the end, a bit of the historical context that lies around this story. Before we do get to the modern day, maybe we can touch on that a little bit and briefly touch on what we know about the UK's involvement in the planning of Operation Blue Star in the 1980s and how particularly that relates to trade relations between the UK and India.
Sure. I mean, what really came about was around about 2014, when you could say government files were accidentally released to the National Archives. And what that revealed was a document in which we could see British Special Forces officer visiting Amritsar in 1984 to advise the Indian Army ahead of Blue Star. Now that was a big revelation. I think we suspected that as a community. There were rumors. I always remember rumors about this, but to see it in document, to see it leaked in, well, I wouldn't say leaked, but you could say leaked. It was accidentally released in 2014. Actually firmed that up. So we could really start joining some of these dots and looking back at that. Now, having been involved in campaigning and lobbying in Parliament, there's always been, I feel, there's always been a barrier with us engaging with MPs, and the response back from members of Parliament, particularly those involved in cabinet. Now, when you do start looking back at this and you start looking at this relationship that stems back from the 80s, you start seeing that reasoning behind why there was, you could say, shadow banning or the blacklisting of speaking up about Sikh issues in India. So we saw this in the leak in 2014, and that led to an investigation. It was a big outrage by the Sikh community. We gelled quite well at that time. We did challenge the then Conservative government, and there was you could say there was an investigation, that was a review that was carried out. It was known as the Hayward Review. Didn't feel that review was robust enough. It was too narrow, and with that, there wasn't really the outcome that we believed was the case. What should have been the case. We felt that it didn't reveal everything, and we knew that. And that's where it sort of lay buried. And then this led to the researcher being commissioned, Phil Miller, who was the individual, the researcher who initially released these documents that he uncovered in 2014 to do some further investigation. And he was commissioned by the Sikh Federation to write a report, which was known as the Sacrificing Sikhs report, which is available on the Sikh Federation website, if you want to look at that in more detail. And in that, we do see a lot more around the repression of Sikh activism during the 80s under the influence of the Indian government on British activity taking place within the diaspora, the Sikh diaspora. So that in that report, you'll see a lot more. And this goes as far as even media, the BBC and ITV not covering any of the issues, being told not to cover the issues. We see the blocking of Nagar Kirtans, Shahidi sports tournaments during that part of the 80s, during 84. And then we see the link to the Westlands helicopter deal that was taking place at the time, and other trade deals as well.
And that was in a case where the Indian military was set to purchase billions of pounds worth of helicopters from the British manufacturers. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, and that was a very big deal, and it was used as leverage by the Indian government at the time, as the report Sacrificing Sikhs discusses.
And so this pattern of behavior and this relationship that stands between India and the UK seems very much alive in today's cases that we're talking about here. in your article and in other articles written on Baaz about this topic, um, they tend to start back previously with the arrest of Jagtar Singh Johal in India, um, under similar sorts of accusations to the West Midlands Three. Um, can you talk just briefly about Jagtar Singh Johal and how you might see it as congruous with that past that we just discussed, as well as the case of the West Midlands Three?
I mean, the Jagtar Singh Johal case. I mean, it's coming up to 4 years now. If I remember correctly, it was November when he was, when he was forcibly abducted by the Indian police. He's with, as a British citizen, is born and bred in the UK, just like myself, just like many other hundreds of thousands of us. Here. He's the way he was picked up, the way he's been treated on both sides by the Indian state, and the neglect that the British government has had in dealing with this situation and allowing it to actually now have been 4 days. I mean, we're talking about 65 trial hearings. We're talking about 1,430 odd days of incarceration. That's shocking. Torture, and people who know how the system works in India, they know that the state can hide behind this type of bureaucracy, and they can use this type of bureaucracy and so-called legal process as a weapon for never-ending rounds of court and detention. And in my view, that's just you could, it's just plain tyranny, really. But the way that that's been carried out, and again, the lack of interest, not just by the government, by the mainstream as well. I mean, thankfully, in a way, thankfully, Jagtar Singh Johal being Scottish has meant that there's more solidarity from Scots, and it's been picked up by the Scottish media. Had Jagtar Singh Johal been perhaps London-based or based in England, I think perhaps even that interest would have been a lot less. But the Scottish media have at least recognised him as a Scot, but he's not recognised as a Brit. And that then talks about the systemic racism that we see in society. That again, just because Jagtar Singh Johal's skin color is not, put it this way: if Jagtar Singh Johal was a white Briton, this would have been a very different case. Would have been a different case by the way it would have been handled by the British government, and the way the Indian government would have also handled it. The Indian judiciary, it would have been very different if Jagtar Singh Johal was white. So again, this is, it does boil down to Jagtar Singh Johal being a Sikh, and the age old, well, it is an age old, this issue that we've had of Sikhs in prison, and in that system being held under arbitrary detention.
And something that's maybe worth touching on is that around the same time is when the height of kind of rhetoric around Brexit is taking off, and where the debate is growing, and there seems to be this push moving towards Brexit. It was suggested by some in the media and some observers that Brexit may increase ties between India and the UK because of how it would affect its trade relations with mainland Europe. I wonder if you have any insight or thoughts about that and how they could possibly be connected.
I mean, just to sort of go to the West Midlands Three there. If we look at the timing of the case of the West Midlands Three, when they were picked up for extradition, when the first raid took place in December 2020, that was following the Foreign Secretary's visit to India, literally days after the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab arrived back in the UK. We saw these very theatrical raids take place, and then the leaking within the media. So we do look at this, and you do have to join the dots and start thinking about, okay, we're not, we're not stupid. We're all intelligent people. We can see that there is some kind of relationship here between securing trade relations and ensuring that India's judiciary system stretches into the UK. And that was the risk with the West Midlands 3. That's why we all woke up with this case, because that's we that lack of trust and confidence that we actually had in the judiciary in the UK as well at that point in time, was that the fact that this risk here means that not only do we have to deal with the Indian media and the way they portray Sikh activism, but then we had a risk here that that judiciary could actually stretch into the UK, and we could start seeing more than just the West Midlands 3 being picked up for their involvement in activism. Now, the West Midlands 3, I mean, they do have, they've always been open about their visits to Punjab in the 2000s. They've been involved in field work in Punjab, particularly around the extrajudicial killings that is public knowledge that we all know took place during the 90s. So they were involved in on grassroots, on the ground activism. So again, being picked up and being treated the way they were treated because of that involvement is a concern to many people involved in activism, just not in the UK, but this could stretch on to other Western nations as well.
And this case of the West Midlands 3 dates back some time. It begins all the way back in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, when they were doing that very type of investigation of extrajudicial killings, and they are accused of being involved with an attack on Rulda Singh, who is a member, and I believe a high-profile member, was a high-profile member of the RSS, of course, the militant wing of the BJP, the ruling party, current ruling party of India, who are themselves Hindutva extremists. So how does this kind of connection get made or get fabricated, and what is the plight from that time till now of these West Midlands 3?
I mean, again, with the what we've seen historically with the cases in India, I mean, once you get into that system, it's easy for cases to be individuals to be implicated in the cases. I mean, Jagtar Singh Johal initially, was picked up for one case, and I think he's in a situation where he's got now 6 cases on him. That what could have happened here with the West Midlands 3, say, for instance, hypothetically speaking, they were extradited on the grounds that there would be no torture relating to the case that they're being extradited for. But we do not have any confidence in the system in India if they had ended up back in India, and perhaps other cases being put upon them, ending up in a situation of torture based on other cases. So we're not talking, it's framing, we're talking about that's the the feeling that we have here is it's easy to be framed for cases. And again, with Rulda Singh, he was high profile. He was a Sikh member of the RSS at the time, and I believe he was murdered, and it's even come out that the witnesses who said he was murdered he was murdered by two monas, which means that there was 2 individuals with their haircut. If I remember reading correctly somewhere, they went off on a motorbike. So again, no evidence to link it back to the individuals who are outwardly the West Midlands who are outwardly Sikh looking, if that was the case anyway. But the West Midlands 3 were clearly not in Punjab at that specific time when that killing took place, that murder took place. And that was the crux, and that was a very important part of the case. Yet, although it was investigated a decade ago by the British police, by West Midlands Police, they concluded that there was no case to answer. We see a decade later the same three being picked up again, but this time round, an extradition to send them back. So that's what really got the reaction within the community, with the Sikh community, saying, "Look, hang on a minute. There wasn't enough evidence there. There was no new evidence presented, as we know now as well, from what the legal team has told us. So there was no new evidence that was presented within the 10 years. Yet, an extradition order was put out on the West Midlands Three."
And I think it's interesting to note that the counselor or the attorney that ended up representing the West Midlands Three, I think among multiple attorneys, but one of them is Gareth Pierce, who famously also had defended Julian Assange's extradition and spoke of this as basically a matter that is hearkening kind of a deeply authoritarian turn in the British government in their comments, and in their case highlighted just what you said, which is that this has been tried and tried again with the same evidence and turned down at every turn. And yet this time around, the Indian government, coincidentally, I suppose, after an important trade meeting that you just referenced, is calling for their extradition. But this time they have the friendly signature of Priti Patel, who is the foreign secretary, if I'm not mistaken.
She's the home secretary.
Excuse me, the home secretary. So, and Priti Patel, maybe we can touch briefly on Priti Patel's role in this. I mean, this is somebody who has very fond words to say of Prime Minister Modi, and has very kind of right-wing authoritarian leanings in her policy and her ideas. So do you think that her being in that position has a part to play in this specific case, and it actually being signed, extradition being signed off this time?
Absolutely, it does, and not just Priti Patel's overtly comments and her fondness of Narendra Modi and the BJP, but in general as well. I mean, she's I think perhaps in my lifetime, Priti Patel is probably the most controversial Home Secretary that the UK has ever had, in terms of all forms of commentary, leaning to the right. Well, not even leaning to the right, very blatantly right wing. And I'm sure you find it strange, just as I do as well, when someone of color in a Western country is so right wing and is put so out there as in terms of their right wing views. So in general, not just Priti Patel's link there, but just her views and the way she conducts her business as a Home Secretary. Many people are calling for her resignation, and that's just not a Sikh call. I mean, there's been a call from the Sikh community, and there's been there's a change.org petition going out there that's hit 11,000 signatures for a resignation. If you look at those signatures, it's completely mixed. The majority are Sikhs, but there's also many non-Sikhs in there.
Well, going back a little bit, another kind of context that is surrounding this whole case, and before we kind of get to the actual proceedings, which just happened on September 22nd, so very recently, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But also surrounding the context of all of this is, of course, the Indian farmers' protests, which are one of probably the biggest a grassroots mobilization in modern history, calling for a halt and a reversal of farming laws that, in effect, would allow large private holdings to play an outsized role in the Indian like produce markets and agricultural goods markets, and would further immiserate the already heavily immiserated, kind of average Indian farmer. And Sikhs are, of course, at the core of this, something we've covered a lot on this podcast. And the reason I bring this up is because, similarly to the way large financial interests combined with state interests played a part in the case of Operation Blue Star back in 1984, I think we can imagine that it's, again, not only the state but also large financial interests that are playing a role in this kind of allowance or encouragement of India's behavior. I mean, do we have any kind of insight or ideas about how the kind of current financial interests of the actual corporations are playing a role in all of this, or is that still murky?
I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, we know there's more to it, but evidence wise, it's difficult to bring that forward. Certainly, the suppression of Sikhs will stem back to the fact that the largest voice in the diaspora around the farmers' issues have been the Sikh voices. So if you want to send a message to those to the people on the ground, then it's almost intimidation tactics in a way, to say we can pick people up from all the way here as well. So certainly there's a link there with the timing of the what took place in December with the raids on and the picking up of the West Midlands 3, because don't forget December was probably the peak at that time of the protest. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this might have been the time when we had Rihanna and Greta and everyone there. So it was big news. It was getting out there, and again, the association of the Sikh with all of that certainly would have had some influence. And I think when you talk to elders and you talk to people who have been involved in the movements, they've always said that the movements they get suppressed, and there'll always be a way of suppressing the movement by a diversion or creating some kind of fear. And that's not just with with the Sikh movements or whatever. I think that's with any movement. That's how statecraft will work, and that's what will take place there. But certainly there's a link, if not financially, but certainly politically. There's a link to the farmers' protests.
And yes, I mean, the current situation now with the West Midlands 3, the actual case and the actual proceedings themselves. Can you tell us about that? I believe you were there, or you were present. I
wasn't. Day. No, and I think maybe maybe my article gives that impression. I mean, everything that I've picked up on is what I've picked up from the Sangat, from the people out there. I mean, yes, I'll be very open. One of the West Midlands 3, I did have a few conversations during the build up, and there were emotional discussions. They were emotional because it was the first time I actually thought, hang on a minute, this, the night before the trial, I was thinking this could be the last night these three guys get to spend with their kids, for all we know. So. The link was there through those, through Sangat and through that emotional connection, as Sad Sangat. But in terms of the dropping of the case, the fact that there wasn't enough, the evidence wasn't strong enough to proceed. So within 10 minutes of the case, the case was dropped. Speaks volumes, because for those 10 months, the families, the stress, the undue stress that these three individuals been through, was unnecessary, and and the community as a whole as well. So over those 10 months, these three weren't alone. And certainly one thing that's come out of this case is that the Panth's got your back. And that's one thing I really felt was a powerful takeaway from this, was that there is mobilization in the Sikh community. And for all our flaws, the strength that we have is that we do mobilize, and we can mobilize. And we've seen that over not in 30 years. We've got 100 years of that history, of being able to mobilize and provide that support. So the fact that on the steps of Westminster Magistrates Court, we've several hundred of the Sangat were there, from young to old, is a massive testimony. To that.
The beautiful scenes of the three men leaving the court, and Jacare coming from the Sangat, were definitely a beautiful thing to see, even from far away.
And I was there in spirit. I may have not been there on the day for whatever reason, but in spirit, there were thousands of us in there, and and I think that we can't take that away from the fact that that's how we're all connected into this story. It's not just three, it's 300,000 of us, or whatever you want to say, whatever the number is, but that's how many people were standing with the three on the day.
And now you mentioned, of course, some of the sort of fallout after all of this is the calling for resignation by Priti Patel. But are you seeing any other kind of movement in the community in how to address these kinds of issues, perhaps proactively, or some kind of a grassroots movement in a direction to fight back in any way?
I mean, Shabd, the one of the biggest concerns that I found in this case was the way the police handled the situation, West Midlands Police, and that needs addressing, immediately, and the way the police have been used as an instrument in this whole process, particularly the West Midlands Police, is of huge concern, because policing is under scrutiny here in the UK anywhere, and the policing reforms of the last decade or so has all been evolved around, has been mainly focused around the policing of ethnic minorities, the Black community, for instance. Now, the policing of the Sikh community, I feel, is at risk, and many of us feel is well, not even at risk. It's deteriorating, and that in itself as well needs mass addressing. But again, the way the police were able to release documentation, share information that was published in the Indian media, not just the West Midlands 3, but there's been cases before of raids a few years ago where 5 Sikhs were raided, and again, how that information was leaked was available to the Indian media, how the Indian media was able to sort of portray that as being, they were able to quite openly say that the Indian government was able to influence these raids 4,000 miles away in the United Kingdom. So
you have the West Midlands Police acting as almost like a political arm of the Indian state.
We have to address that in a big way. And again, these forums and independent advisory groups that exist with the police. I mean, I've been on independent advisory groups for the Metropolitan Police in London. Although I speak quite openly about the way the police have handled this and the West Midlands Police, I myself have a relationship with the police where I support the training of new recruits in terms of diversity, and the new recruits in my local unit here. When they join, I give them a whole briefing on what a Sikh is, on the Kirpan, Kakars, etc. So I'm a firm believer that we work in collaboration and work together. But then my concern here in a big way also is that when we see this kind of these kind of tactics being employed by the West Midlands Police, where they release statements to the press themselves as well, where they talk about there's an increase in terrorism. There's risks around terrorism, and there was one that came out on the 20th of January of this year, on the day of Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Gurpurb. So the timing of that was a shock in itself. But the headline itself was evolved around. Well, I think if I remember, I'm just seeing the headline here. Police have identified a small threat, and it said small inverted commas, small threat from the Sikh extremists, and then the subheading, a police chief has revealed the West Midlands Force has been targeting Sikh terrorists operating in the region. So they bring this out in a statement. So that this comes out in a press release. Yet the community in the West Midlands know nothing about this. There's been no engagement with the Gurdwaras. There's been no engagement with grassroots organizations or anything about this statement and what the West Midlands Police are claiming. But this then sets a narrative. This then sets out a communication and then creates a perception. So now you've got this out there on a Google search. If I was to type Sikh extremism, I will see a 2021 article from January with that headline, and then you read it inside there. There's not much substance to the article, but yet that big headline was allowed to be sent out and demonize a community and allow that. And look, none of us are saying that terrorism is a profoundly serious criminal offense. We know that. We're not fools to that. But if you're going to use that statement, if you're going to make those kind of statements, then involve us. Give us the stats. Tell us what cases you are talking about, and they never did that.
Right, and then when the cases do come up that are labeled as anti-terrorist, and they are full of these essentially fabricated stories, and the folks that are being targeted as in these terrorist cases are people that are doing research on human rights abuses, it sounds like terrorism here is being applied in a way, again, that is politically motivated and has is being used as a means to quash the dissident voice that is raising genuine concerns.
I mean, sometimes what you see in these articles, and that specific article was the word separatist and terrorist almost interchangeable. Now, again, what you're straight away assuming is that any form of separatism or that kind of thought is a terrorist thought, and if that was the case, then Nicola Sturgeon, leader of the Scottish National Party, straight away, you're saying that she's advocated for an independent Scotland. Is she running a terrorist organization if she believes in all of that? So again, but they're able to get away with using that interchangeable language. But that's a huge has a huge impact on perception of Sikh activism and what we are.
And something that you wrote in your article is the last paragraph that I thought was very poignant. And I think in contrast to the kind of activism that we saw rally around in support of the West Midlands Three, being a dissident and, a dissident and critical kind of activism that is looking to oppose tyranny, we see, and you write, we see an increasing aesthetic portrayal of in inverted commas, Anglo-Sikh relationships, with war memorials being dedicated to tens of thousands of Sikh soldiers who served and died for Britain during the two world wars. The question that therefore arises is that in this 180-year-old relationship, who really benefits and who is continually being sacrificed. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that paragraph and kind of what you're thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, that really hits a nerve with me, and I think that was sort of that emotional conclusion or climax to the article, because we get seduced into the whole Sikh soldier, fighting for Britain narrative, and look, it's there. It's part of our history. It's there. It's the reason why migration and everything started at the turn of the 20th century. So we can't erase it from our history, but I think we do need to address and look at what we see and the framing of how we see that era and that period. Now, at this point in time, there's been a lot of investment by the community themselves, by the Sikh community themselves, into these war memorials that have sprung up across the UK. There've been several now. I think we probably might be even reaching double figures now of the various different war memorials that are coming up. But does this really represent the relationship? Are we just trying to fit into some kind of box or a subservient relationship with the UK to say, we fought for you, therefore we deserve better? The reality of it, we do have to look at this and look at this history and say, how were Sikhs exploited? How were we used as cannon fodder? And the lives that we lost. So it has to be seen from a very different lens. And currently, I think our investment in this is overshadowing and masking the real relationship that I feel we have with the United Kingdom. And for the record, I'm going to be called a hypocrite here because I am actually a trustee of the National Sikh War Memorial Trust. That's looking at erecting a war memorial dedicated to Sikhs in the city centre in London, in the heart of the city. So, granted that's a very hypocritical statement for me to make, but my evolution of thought since I came onto this project, since I've learned a lot more, and the culture, I suppose the woke culture has got a lot of thinking going on as well, because we do look at the Black Lives Movement, and now we do relate our history as well. And we're understanding our history better. We're getting more clarity around it. We're seeing it through different lenses. And even now, from when I started on this project to where I am now, even I now question that even if there was to be a war memorial, either we take full responsibility with the narrative around the war memorial, because these people didn't fight for king and country. There was a seduction, there was an exploitation, whatever you want to call it. But the way the Sikhs came forward and gave their lives, is it something we should commemorate in the way we commemorate, or is it something that's a lot more darker
Certainly
than that?
And I think that's really well stated. I mean, I think that the notion or the question of sort of, or the debate between memorial or no memorial is perhaps moot, and rather, if you are going to memorialize that time, how will you do it? And will it be one that's like you're talking about, that's a bit more critical and a bit more dissident of that relationship, as opposed to kind of saying, look at us, we belong here too, as though that kind of allowing being, a community can only belong in this broader culture if they have some sort of blood sacrifice or contribution to the state, as opposed to simply, humanity kind of governing who gets to live where and how people are treated. And I think it's really commendable of you to bring up that hypocrisy and to talk about your own evolution there, and I'm grateful for it. I think that's a good place to leave things for now. But I'm so very grateful for your time, Mankamal Singh, and I hope you'll join us again.
No, absolutely. No, thank you, Shabd. I mean, as I said before we started recording this, I think these podcasts are great, and I've only really discovered these post lockdown, the benefit of podcasts. So, well, thank you for touching on this subject and giving me the opportunity to put my thoughts forward.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.
Okay. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much to Mankamal Singh for joining us today. I thought that was a really fascinating discussion, and I hope that you all learned as much as I did. Once again, this is the Baaz Podcast. We hope that you join us every other Tuesday as we talk to writers, journalists, and thinkers in the Sikh community on issues of the Sikh and Punjabi diaspora. And we will see you Tuesday after next. Thank you. Bye-bye.